Chronology of a Systemic Failure, the Jeffrey Epstein Case, 2004-2026. The Jeffrey Epstein story didn't collapse the public's trust because it was shocking. It collapsed trust because it looked again and again like the system knew and still found ways to look away. Over 2 decades, the case moved like a slow chemical leak through American institutions. A local police inquiry became a national reckoning, not because justice moved quickly, but because it didn't. This is the anatomy of a legal Gordian knot. Evidence on one side, insulation on the other. And when insulation is built from money, access, and fear of consequences, the knot tightens instead of loosens. 4 pillars hold the chronology in place. Survivors who refuse to be erased, a plea deal that narrowed the case to near meaninglessness, a network that wasn't confined to one coastline, and finally, document releases so large they forced the country to stare at the machinery. Most people remember the 2019 arrest because it was loud, but the blueprint of failure was drafted earlier, in quiet rooms where reputations matter more than victims, and resolution can mean containment. The first spark came from Palm Beach, a report involving a 14-year-old. One complaint was enough to open the door, and once it opened, investigators kept finding more rooms. Witness accounts and police work began sketching the outline of a system, not a single predator acting alone, but a repeating pipeline designed to recruit, rotate, and replace. The recruitment model, as described by multiple accounts, functioned like a referral business. Girls were pulled in, then pressured or paid to bring other girls, an arrangement that converted victims into the next link in the chain. It was predatory not only in method, but in specificity. The allegations describe a preference for very young targets, and the contempt of power when recruits didn't match the desired profile. By 2005, searches reportedly produced the kind of corroboration that should harden a case, physical details that matched survivor descriptions, and records that suggested routine and repetition. But then came the detail that reads like a warning label: hardware present, storage missing. Computer monitors and keyboards were there, hard drives were not. In any major investigation, that absence is a story in itself because it suggests time, foreknowledge, and someone choosing what the police would never see. By 2008, the legal trajectory should have been tightening towards serious accountability. Instead, it bent toward an outcome that critics would later describe as a sweetheart deal, because the punishment looked out of proportion to the allegations described by victims and investigators. The defining feature wasn't only leniency, it was structure, the way the agreement constrained what the justice system could pursue next. When a deal protects broad categories of potential co-conspirators, it doesn't just limit one prosecution. It walls off an ecosystem, and it signals to everyone around the center that the perimeter is safe. In practice, that kind of immunity is a legal trapdoor. The central figure takes a hit that looks like accountability, while the network, the recruiters, facilitators, fixers, and silencers, stays out in the open. That's why the deal matters historically. It didn't merely end a case, it shaped a decade. The case's second life didn't begin inside government, it began outside it, through civil litigation and journalism, where secrecy can be pried open by subpoenas, filings, and public exposure. Virginia Giuffre became one of the central catalysts in that phase. Through lawsuits and testimony, she helped keep the narrative from being sealed inside procedural language and forgotten. Then came the reporting that turned a closed door into a public scandal. Miami Herald published a series that mapped in plain view how the 2008 agreement was constructed and why it had stayed hidden. The reporting did something the system had not. It made the mechanics legible, how legal process, discretion, and influence can converge into a result that looks lawful but feels like a betrayal. and a technical truth landed like a moral insult. Victims argued their rights had been violated, but procedural framing limited what the law could enforce in that moment. The gap between justice as principle and justice as paperwork became part of the story's gravity. In July 2019, the Southern District of New York, U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, arrested Epstein on federal charges. For the public, it felt like the system had finally changed its posture from negotiation to confrontation. Then, on August 10, 2019, Epstein was found dead in federal custody. The shock was immediate, and so was the suspicion, not just about one death, but about whether the system could be trusted to hold a powerful defendant long enough for truth to surface. The U.S. Justice Department Inspector General, led by Michael Horowitz, concluded the death was a suicide and documented cascading failures at Metropolitan Correctional Center, New York, including serious breakdowns in custody, supervision, and protocol. Those failures mattered because they weren't abstract. They were the difference between a defendant who could be tried and a defendant who could never be questioned again. In 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted and sentenced to 20 years, a rare moment where the perimeter of the system didn't hold. The verdict established that proximity to elite circles wasn't automatic immunity, even if the public still argued about what remained uncharged. On January 30, 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice announced it had published roughly 3.5 million pages of material in compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Major reporting described the release as enormous in volume, millions of pages plus thousands of videos and a large set of images, paired with heavy redactions and renewed survivor anger about privacy and exposure. This is where modern audiences often make a mistake. A mention in documents, a contact in a ledger, or a name in correspondence is not proof of a crime. It can be context, an allegation, a tip, a rumor, or simply proximity in a social world that Epstein cultivated. The real historical significance of the dump is procedural. After years of sealed files and partial visibility, the record became too large to hide behind vague summaries and too public to manage quietly. Your draft also references a Department of Government Efficiency push for transparency. A White House order in February 2025 describes a Department of Government Efficiency cost efficiency initiative framed around transparency and accountability in spending. But its direct operational role in the Epstein document release should only be asserted when a primary source explicitly connects it. This saga is not only about one predator, it's about how systems behave when reputational risk becomes the invisible stakeholder in a criminal process. In 2005, evidence questions surfaced that still haunt the record. In 2008, a deal turned a sprawling investigation into something small enough to survive politically. In the 2010s, survivors and journalists forced the case back into daylight. In 2019, federal prosecutors moved, then custody failures ended the central prosecution before it could reach a jury. And in 2026, the country received a mountain of paper, not closure, paper. The lesson is ugly, but historically consistent. When power bends the system, transparency is often the only counterweight. And transparency rarely arrives because institutions volunteer it. It arrives because pressure makes silence impossible. Glossary, documentary tight. If you watch us, it means you're growing with us.